Dialing an espresso can be complicated. Or at least it tends to be viewed as more complicated than it is. Now, I'm not trying to downplay how difficult it might be. For some people with their coffee choices and their equipment, it can be quite challenging, and for others, it can be a bit easier. But I do think that we overly complicate the process. Now, there are a lot of variables that we need to understand, but in order to get to a place where it's good in the cup, you don't need to manipulate every single variable in order to optimize your cup experience. And that's why in recent videos I talked about, mostly focusing on grind size and ratio. Now, when it comes to ratio, there seems to be a lot of confusion or just general discombobulation as to where they should even begin with coffees. Should all light roasts be big ratios, all dark roasts small ratios? Or should we all try to fit in any coffee we have to this idealized 1:2 ratio, where it's 1 gram of coffee to 2 grams of water, or 18 grams of coffee to 36 grams of water, whatever that might be. This kind of traditional narrative that we are trying to fit or push onto every coffee that we have. So today I have some tricks that I want to kind of showcase. Some of them are definitely known tricks, and one I've shown in a past video, but other ones that can kind of help you develop your palate in one way, but in another way, it can help you understand what parts of the extraction you might enjoy, what parts you might want to include, what parts you might want to exclude, and ways of testing your coffee without having to pull 1,000 shots in order to find the right ratio for you. What I'm gonna go over in this video is firstly, what's called a salami shot. First started doing salami shots about 8 years ago when I was training baristas, but I saw that Baca had made a video on it on YouTube quite some time ago, and a lot of people knew it from there. I also put it in my first ever espresso video here on YouTube, but I find it's a very helpful way of understanding the different sections of how espresso kind of extracts with each given coffee. And it's a very easy thing to do, and it really illuminates for you what comes out when during an espresso extraction for whatever given coffee on whatever given equipment you might have. The second will be a tip that I gave in a recent video, which is essentially pulling extra espresso into a separate cup after you hit your typical or aimed for ratio. This will allow you to add in some of that excess without having to pull 2 different shots at 2 different ratios. And then lastly, I think there's a very interesting area that's not really been explored too much, which is either increasing your ratio of your extraction or stopping the extraction shorter, and instead of increasing the ratio of water going through the puck, which at the end of the extraction doesn't have too much more to give, versus putting just hot water into your cup in order to stretch out the flavors. The inspiration for this test comes from the world of like whiskey, where they're using droplets of water in order to expand or open up the taste of that highly concentrated beverage. We do the same thing with water in espresso, but it's mostly done to the size of like an Americano, so 200 mils of water or something along those lines. But it might be really helpful to kind of play around with adding 20 mils of water, 30 mils of water, in order to minorly stretch out espresso as opposed to just running a longer shot. You can practice these at home. Obviously, you don't need to replicate the extractions or the TDSs. This is just so that we have an understanding of how much is being extracted throughout the equation. So let's start off with a salami shot. A bigger shot would likely be more helpful, so I would recommend doing something closer to like a 1:3 ratio, because this will give you more areas of the shot to taste. But essentially what we're doing in a salami shot is we're literally cutting up or chopping up like a salami the espresso. I'm pulling out 50 grams of espresso, and every 10 grams, I'm gonna switch out the cup. We will be able to see the color differentiation, the viscosity differentiation, and the TDS differentiation amongst these 5 different cups. And then you just go through and taste them in order to have an understanding of what exactly is coming out early on, what exactly is coming out near the end, what temperature differentials do we see, etc., etc. Doing it exactly every 10 grams is not necessary. You could do 5 at the beginning, then 10, and then eyeball it, whatever you want to do. I'm just doing this for the sake of evenness throughout, and we can also kind of note the times that it takes for each of these 10-gram parts. At the very beginning, the puck, the dry powder is being wetted, but once it begins to extract a lot, after those first 10 grams, it really begins to increase the flow rate through the filter, AKA the coffee puck. Now, as it's extracting more and more, there's less resistance that the coffee puck can actually give the water coming through. So in order to make up for the weakening resistance of the puck, the flow rate from the machine continually increases to maintain that 9 bar. The implications of this is, one, as it continues to extract, the espresso will become more and more dilute, and two, as it continues to extract, it will become more and more hot, and that's because that puck is no longer able to absorb as much heat. It's essentially matched the temperature of the water going through, whereas early on, it was a room temperature puck. It was able to absorb some of that heat for the initial drips. So in this first cup, I actually was not able to read the TDS, the total dissolved solids, which just means the fraction of the liquid that is actually not water. The VST refractometer, it was not able to get as high as this needed to be read. It was sample out of range. I added 1 squirt of water on it from one of my RDT bottles in order to almost double the volume of the liquid inside the dish itself. Once I did that, it was able to read 21.85. So I'm assuming this first cup is over 30% TDS, though I don't have an exact number. That's what it was. The second cup, the second 10 seconds, drops all the way from that 30 or so percent down to around 7.5%. So exactly, it was 7.37. So we had a massive drop off from the first 10 grams to the second 10 grams as regards that concentration. Now, of course, in the first 10 grams, we're also getting a lot of those fines or those tiny particles that are able to be washed off the grounds as it's pushing through with the initial pressure. In the second one, we're getting a lot less of that, and so it's more so focusing on the extraction, or at least that's what I'm theorizing or speculating. The third cup, the third 10 grams, dropped even further. It was down to about 3.68. And then the fourth cup was about 2.74, and the final cup 2.08. So when we put them all together, that's going to give us a TDS of somewhere around 10 to 11%, maybe just a little less, maybe 9%, and probably an extraction yield of around 21 or so percent overall. Okay, got it. This first cup will be incredibly thick and is going to be very coating. So maybe take a sip as it is, but I would recommend adding a little water to it to open it up a bit, because this is such a high concentration. It's going to completely coat your tongue in a way that is unrealistic for a typical coffee tasting. So we can take a little sip just to see what it's like. Woo! Which is very, very sour, also very bitter because it has a heavy concentration of those fines, and it's incredibly coating, very thick. Like I said, it's like soy sauce. But then we can take a little water, we can add just a bit to stretch it out to really get an idea of what the flavors of this early extraction actually taste like. It's hard to really understand the different flavors in it at such a high concentration, so opening up with some water can be helpful to have a better understanding of what goes on in these first 10 grams. Okay, so it's a lot less potent, a lot less tart. We can see what flavors we're getting from it, though. There's some that are almost kind of green flavors, like vegetal flavors that are coming out super early on. There's still an intense salty note that's sitting on the back of my tongue. The sourness has gone down a lot because I've been able to dilute it, but overall I'm able to get this weird lasting coating finish that is not pleasant at all. It's very brothy, something that I just do not enjoy at all. So we can move on to the second cup. That is literally 1/3 or 1/4 even of the concentration, so we don't need to dilute this. This is much closer to a typical espresso. We taste that. That is much more palatable. It's actually pretty... It's not bad. It's losing balance in the sense that there's not much acidity going on. Already a lot of that acidity, that the perception of acidity, when I think of acidity, I'm thinking citric malic, the tart kind of punchy acidity. Most of that's already gone. It was largely in this first cup. This one I'm tasting more of the sugar browning notes, and I'm getting some of the bitterness coming through, caramelization, things like that. We move to the third one. It's quite watery, and in fact, some of the acidity comes back out, at least its perception. That does not mean that it has higher acidity content than here. It just means the perception, my perception of it has increased, which might just mean that the caramelization effect has decreased in this cup enough to allow some of the acidity to come back out, or it's the much lower TDS that's allowing for it. Remember, we went from around 7.5 to around 3.5, so that can kind of explain some of that. Then we go down to the fourth 10-gram cup, which this is down to, a little bit lower and down that 2.7 or so TDS. Some bitterness, some dryingness, but honestly, it's not super off-putting. It's incredibly watery. There's a little bit of bitterness, but nothing that's too bad. Honestly, it reminds me of like if you do one of those Oolongé style shots on an espresso with like a decent Nespresso pod. It's very dilute. It's not great. It's not offensive. It's just, you know, it's a coffee with a low TDS. It is what it is. Now this last one is the lowest TDS. The crema is all chunky and broken up on top. It's very weird. That's incredibly watery. It has a little bit of a sweetness to it, but all in all, it tastes like brown water. There's nothing special about it. There's not much recalling coffee other than a hint of coffee in it. There's no real perception of acidity or sweetness that could balance up the cup. I think this is a really good practice that you can do at home with some friends, with, you know, whomever you might have over, to understand where these different things are going on in the espresso extraction, because I think we have a really flawed perception of what that might be. I often hear people talk about how coffees are just sour, whereas a lot of that could just be a sour extraction. I've never really had a sour coffee, just sour extractions. The bulk of the perception of sour acidity comes out early on, can help us when we're trying to stretch out coffees and make them less sour. So if you just got in the light roast world and they all taste sour, maybe stretch the ratio out a bit, and that's going to help balance it out. Or if you have something that you want more acidity to come out, maybe truncate it a bit. The shorter you go, the more that perception may increase. That doesn't mean that the presence of acidity increases. It means the perception. Now, those are two completely different things. We won't get into it here, but just understand that whenever we're talking about acidity, it's always about the perception. Same with sweetness. There's not enough sugar in coffee for our palates to actually taste. What we're tasting, we're not quite sure yet, but it's a perception, not a reality. Let's say that you were set on a 1 to 2 because that's what someone recommended to you. They said this coffee's great at 18 grams in, 36 grams out in 30 seconds. It's fantastic. But you're tasting it and you're going, man, this is a little sour to me. So either my friend has a crappy palate and does not have good taste in coffee, or the more reasonable, my equipment is not identical to theirs. My setup is not identical to theirs. My palate is not identical to theirs. So let's say you have it dialed in, that 18, 36, and 30 seconds, whatever it might be. Then take a couple of cups, and every 5 grams or so, after you hit your target weight, just switch out and get a couple of those 5 gram amounts into separate cups afterwards. Okay. All right, so what I have here is a 17 gram shot with 34 grams out, and then I pulled an extra 5 roughly and another extra 5 roughly. So what I'm gonna do is stir this up and take a sip. And then I'll decide, how does this taste? Do I need to add some of this, or am I good to go? So we'll take a little spoon, we'll give it a nice little stir, take a sip. And yep, that is too sour. For me, that is too sour, so I'm gonna take a little bit extra, 5 grams extra in there. Now I'm gonna stir it up, make sure it's nicely integrated, and take a sip. Actually, that is still just a bit sour for my liking. So I'm gonna take that last 5 grams, I'm gonna add that in, and we're gonna see how that tastes. Stir it up, and that's actually perfect. So now I know when I am brewing that if I want to have this shot, a much nicer one, I'm not going to change grind size, I'm not going to change anything, I'm just going to increase the output by 10 grams. And what that's going to give me is maybe a little bit extra time, probably another 3 or so seconds depending on the flow rate at the end of the shot, but it'll give me a much more palatable shot. I know what that is for my next shot, and I didn't have to waste this shot finding that out. Now you can also sit there and taste, there's an astringency at the finish, probably from too long of contact time. Then you can maybe change your grind setting a bit, still do the same yield and with sans the astringency or whatever it might be that's causing some of the issues there. You can go a bit coarser, maybe get less astringent compounds going through to the final cup. But the idea is to waste less coffee while still getting an understanding of what this different ratio will taste like. Because as I can't say enough, ratio is the #1 dictator on extraction yield. As we saw with that earlier salami shot, the longer you go in that extraction, the lower the extraction yield becomes. So maybe it's not the best idea to do all of that water through the puck of coffee. Maybe we can hit that really vibrant, juicy shot earlier and then just bypass with some water to make kind of like a really small Americano. Because a lot of people just don't think about this. They don't think about just adding a little water to open up that espresso into something completely different, maybe more palatable, because some of those flavors can get lost and blended when it's too concentrated, but when you open it up, it can open up a whole new world of flavor for you. So I've pulled the 2 shots. This one is about 17 in and 85 out, whereas this one was 17 in, 40 out. Now the TDSs of them were quite different. This one was right around 5.32, whereas this one was right at 9.68. That just means that the concentration of this one was almost double that of this one, which makes sense. We've diluted this one with 45 extra grams. But the interesting thing is, whereas TDS is one metric, extraction yield shows us how much of the bean or how much efficiency there was in dissolving that bean. You would think if it was double the TDS, it may be double the extraction, but in reality, that's not at all the case. This one extracted right around 22.5%, whereas this one extracted only at 25%. So whereas we had a massive differentiation of TDS, there wasn't that big of a difference in extraction yield, about 2.5 percentage points. In reality, yes, that is quite a bit because we're only really extracting from 18 to around 26% overall as far as like what is realistic. But those last few percentages aren't drastically revolutionizing your cup. In fact, I've been a big proponent of not really ever going above 22 because what we've seen with some recent studies by Dr. Smrke out at Zurich is that a lot of those interesting acidities, the perception at least thereof, are kind of go away the higher the extraction is. So whereas some may come out, some of the more intense ones tend to go away. So what we can do here is we can have a taste and see how each of these kind of taste on their own. And then if we want to stretch out flavor more, maybe this one has too, held together flavor and we want to stretch it out, we could just add water as opposed to making it a bigger shot through the espresso machine while also getting a higher extraction. Higher extraction does not always mean good, and in fact, I would argue in most places, once you're up in this realm, it's not very good. Obviously, if we're doing 14% versus 20, then higher is better, sure. But I'm talking about in this upper range, there's a big difference between 26 and 22, and I more times than not would choose that 22 regardless of what the coffee is. All right, so we're gonna taste this Oolongé. It's nice. It is a fruit bomb. It's got some intense acidity there, but it's not a punch of it. It's not a high concentration of it. It's definitely spread out. It's closer to kind of like a tisane that has like added fruits into it. So it's got a very nice thinner body, still thick because we're sitting at 5.5 TDS. That's 4 times as thick as a filter coffee, but it also has kind of an underwhelming finish that I think could be smoothed out if we didn't have the contact time so long, if we didn't push the extraction as far. So I'm curious what this one will taste like with some hot water added in order to make it the same weight. So I'm just gonna take a scale, take some water from the kettle that's heated up. We're gonna just bring it up to the same weight roughly. So I added 45 grams of water. Now stir it up. And so for me, this is much, much better. That finish is nowhere near as kind of bitter, drying as this one is, while still giving me all of those flavors that I found in this one. It's got a bit nicer aroma, to be honest with you, which might be because it wasn't as long inside of that espresso machine. It didn't have as long of an extraction. But in the end, this is my preference here. There have been times where I preferred the Oolongé, but this is something that you can play around with as well. Whenever we pull a shot, it might taste too concentrated and you're like, oh, I just need to pull a longer shot. First, try adding a little bit of water to it, and that might absolutely change it. You're still drinking pure coffee, it's still coffee water, but you're doing it in a different way. You're not necessarily relying on the extraction the whole way through. So anyway, give these 3 things a try. Hopefully they help you learn a bit more about your espresso. Hopefully you have some fun while doing it, because that's all we want to do, is we want to have a little bit of fun tonight. No, that was forced. I didn't like that one. People always ask for singing though, and it's hard to want to force it in. But anyway, I hope that these 3 tips or practices, whatever you want to call them, I hope that they're helpful to you in building your own lexicon of flavor notes, building your kind of approach to dialing in, and helping you understand the different dynamics throughout extraction that can affect the cup that you are about to brew. But anyway, as you sit there and finish up this video, I'm going to finish up this coffee. I hope that you brew something tasty today, and cheers.